The winds howled through the barren landscape of the planet Ivorus. Its surface was dry, cracked, and desolate, with nothing but dust and jagged rocks scattered in every direction. The sky above was a dull gray, and the only sounds that could be heard were the howling winds and the distant growls of the dangerous creatures that roamed the planet. Lyra, an alien warrior, lay motionless on the cold ground, her breathing shallow and ragged. Her body was covered in cuts and bruises, and her armor was cracked and torn. The blood from her wounds stained the dirt beneath her, marking the spot where she had fallen. She had fought valiantly, but in the end, it hadn't been enough. She had been part of the small strike force sent to take down an enemy camp. Her people, a warrior race known for their strength and honor, had sent her because they believed in her ability to win the fight. But things hadn't gone as planned. The enemy forces were larger and better equipped than expected. Lyra had fought with all her might, but the battle turned against them quickly. She had seen her comrades fall, one by one, their bodies littering the ground like discarded toys. She had tried to escape, but the enemy had surrounded her, capturing her and taking her to a desolate spot far from the battlefield. She had been left for dead. The betrayal stung more than the physical pain. Her people, her comrades, had abandoned her. She had refused to follow their orders to slaughter civilians, and because of that, she had been marked as a traitor. They had decided it was easier to leave her behind than to face the consequences of her defiance. Her once strong body now felt like lead. Her muscles burned with the effort to move, but it was useless. She could feel herself slipping away, her vision fading into darkness. Her thoughts grew blurry, and her strength waned. This was how it would end, alone, abandoned, and forgotten. Then, just as the darkness began to take over, she heard something, a sound, faint at first, like footsteps. But it wasn't the heavy steps of an enemy soldier. It was different, lighter, almost human. She could barely hold onto the thought as it slipped through her mind. But something inside her stirred. Was it hope? She opened her eyes, blinking against the harsh winds. Through the blur of her vision, she saw a figure approaching, a human soldier. Her mind struggled to comprehend it. Why would a human be here, on a planet that was far from their known territories? The human knelt down beside her, and his face came into view. He was young, with dark hair and a hardened expression, but his eyes were filled with concern. He was dressed in light combat armor, his face covered with dirt and sweat from the harsh conditions. "Hey," the human said softly, his voice low but clear. "Can you hear me?" Lyra could barely focus on his words. Her vision was still blurry, and the pain in her body was overwhelming. She opened her mouth to speak but could only manage a weak gasp. The soldier seemed to notice her struggle, and without a second thought, he pulled out a small med pack from his belt. He quickly began administering first aid, carefully cleaning the wounds on her arms and legs. His movements were quick but gentle, his focus entirely on her. "Stay with me," he murmured, his voice steady and calm, as though he had done this many times before. Lyra felt a flicker of warmth inside her chest. She had been abandoned, left to die alone. Yet here, in the most unexpected of places, was a human, someone from a race she had been taught to view as weak and insignificant. And yet, he was saving her. Why? Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. The soldier paused for a moment, his eyes meeting hers. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something else in his eyes, an understanding, a shared pain that mirrored her own. But then, he looked away, focusing again on her wounds. "I can't leave you like this," he said simply. "You've been hurt. I'm just doing what anyone would do. Anyone." Lyra's mind felt heavy with confusion. How could this human, a being from a race she had once thought of as inferior, show such kindness? As he worked to patch up her wounds, Lyra felt herself growing weaker. The world around her seemed to tilt and spin, the darkness creeping closer with each passing second. But the human didn't stop. He kept working, his hands steady and sure. The pain in her body was starting to subside, but it was replaced by an even stronger feeling: guilt. Why would he help her? She was a traitor to her people, a failure as a warrior. She had dishonored her race by refusing to carry out their orders. Why should he care? I don't deserve your help, Lyra managed to say, her voice trembling. With the weight of her thoughts, I've failed. My people have abandoned me. The soldier paused once more, his hands resting on her arm. He looked down at her with a mixture of empathy and determination. You deserve better than to be left alone to die in this place, he said softly. I won't abandon you. You don't have to fight alone anymore. Lyra's heart ached at his words. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope. She didn't know this human. She didn't know if she could trust him. But in this moment, she didn't have much of a choice. He was the only one who had chosen to help her. Thank you, she whispered. Her voice barely a breath. The human nodded, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet promise that he would keep her safe. He gently picked her up, cradling her in his arms as he began to walk. I'm Mark, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos of their situation, and we're getting you out of here. Lyra closed her eyes, finally letting go of the weight of the world that had held her down for so long. She had been abandoned, but now, in the arms of this strange human, she had been given a chance at survival. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe in something else. Hope. The hours passed in silence as Mark carried Lyra through the desolate landscape of Ivris. The terrain was harsh, the ground cracked and uneven, but Mark's steps were steady. Lyra, despite her injuries, tried to remain awake. She didn't want to miss anything. The alien planet was strange to her now. She had no idea where she was or where Mark was taking her. With each passing minute, her body grew weaker, and her breathing became more labored. She felt the weight of her failure as a warrior, as someone who had let her people down. Her race, the Velrith, were known across the galaxy for their strength and honor. But Lyra had failed to live up to the expectations. She had refused to follow orders that would have led to the massacre of innocent civilians. For that, she had been abandoned, left to die on this forsaken planet. But now, here she was, cradled in the arms of a human, a race she had once considered inferior. Where are you taking me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mark glanced down at her, his eyes serious but kind. There's a safe place, just a little farther ahead. We'll be out of sight from the enemy. You'll be able to rest, get some food, and heal. I'll make sure you're taken care of. Lyra wanted to protest, to tell him that she didn't deserve his help, but the words caught in her throat. She was tired, so tired. Her head rested against his chest, and she closed her eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It was a comforting sound, and like anything she had heard on the battlefield, for a brief moment, she allowed herself to relax, to not think about the past. They reached a small outpost hidden in the rocky hills after what felt like an eternity of walking. It was a modest structure, made of reinforced metal and stone, offering shelter from the harsh elements of Ivris. The outside was battered, covered in dirt and scratches from the rough terrain. But Mark didn't hesitate. He carefully carried Lyra inside and laid her down on a cot, taking a moment to breathe before moving to a small table to gather supplies. Lyra tried to sit up but was too weak. Her body felt like it was made of lead. She could only watch as Mark went to work. He opened a small storage container and pulled out a first aid kit, a few packets of food, and a canteen of water. This place is all I've got, he said quietly. It's not much, but it's enough to keep us alive for a little while. Lyra watched him carefully. She had never seen a human work with such efficiency. There was no panic, no hesitation. He moved with a purpose, taking care of everything, without once looking back at her. You're not like what I thought, she said after a long pause. Mark turned to face her, surprised. What do you mean? Lyra hesitated before answering. I thought humans were weak, that you only cared about yourselves and that you didn't understand the meaning of honor. But you're different. You're helping me, a warrior of my kind. After everything that's happened to me, I didn't think anyone would. Mark sat down on the edge of the cot, his face softening. I've seen enough pain in this galaxy to know that we all have our own battles to fight. We're not all the same. We're not perfect, but I don't believe anyone deserves to be left to die, especially when they've been hurt. Lyra's eyes studied him, trying to understand his words. She had been raised to believe that humans were nothing, more than simple creatures. They were far from the warriors she knew without the strength, without the discipline to face a true battle. But as she looked at Mark, she realized that maybe she had been wrong. His actions spoke louder than anything she had been taught. "You don't even know me," Lyra whispered. "You don't know what I've done or what I've failed to do." Mark's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. "It doesn't matter. I know that right now. You're here, you're alive, and that's enough for me." Lyra could see the sincerity in his eyes, and for a moment, she felt a tear slip from her eye. Something she had not allowed herself to do in years. She quickly wiped it away, feeling a rush of shame. Her people didn't cry. They didn't show weakness. But in the presence of this human, she felt the weight of her burden lighten. "If only a little. You'll heal," Mark continued, "but you're going to need rest. You're not alone anymore." Lyra nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She closed her eyes, trying to rest, but sleep was elusive. Her mind kept returning to her past, to the Vilrith Empire, and the betrayal that had led her here. She had once been part of something greater than herself, a warrior chosen to lead, to protect her people. But now, she was nothing, a failure. A part of her wanted to pull away from Mark, to shut him out. But another part of her, a part she had buried deep inside, wanted to trust him, wanted to believe that there was a way forward, a way out of the darkness. As she lay on the cot, her mind drifting in and out of sleep, Mark remained close, watching over her. He didn't ask questions. He didn't judge. He simply sat there, offering her the one thing she hadn't known she needed, kindness. When she woke, the first thing she noticed was that the pain in her body had lessened. Her wounds had been treated, and the sharp, agonizing ache in her limbs was fading. Mark was still there, sitting at the table with a map spread out in front of him. His focus was on something else, but when he heard her stir, he quickly turned to face her, feeling better. He asked. Lyra nodded, her voice still weak. "I didn't think I'd make it." "You did," Mark said with a small smile, "and I'm not going anywhere. I'm here." For the first time since her people had left her, Lyra allowed herself to believe it. She wasn't alone anymore. Not completely. The days passed slowly as Lyra's body began to heal. Mark took care of her every need, making sure she stayed hydrated, fed, and comfortable. He didn't ask about her past, and she didn't offer any information, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Lyra wasn't ready to share her story. She wasn't sure she could. She had been raised to be strong, to be unbreakable. She had been trained to lead, to fight without hesitation, and to follow orders without question. But everything had changed. She had been forced to leave behind her pride, her people, and her home. Her identity as a Vilrith warrior no longer meant anything. She was just a survivor now. One morning, as Lyra sat on the cot, looking out of the small window of the shelter, Mark walked in. He had a simple meal in his hands, a small portion of bread and some dry meat. His eyes were soft, and he had a thoughtful expression on his face. "Here. I thought you might be hungry," he said gently, handing her the meal. Lyra nodded, accepting the food. She hadn't spoken much since they had first met, but the silence between them was comfortable. There was no pressure to explain anything, no need to rush into conversation. But now, with the quiet of the room surrounding them, she felt the weight of her past pulling at her. Mark sat down across from her, watching her carefully. "You don't have to tell me anything if you're not ready," he said, breaking the silence. "But I can't help you unless I understand what happened." Lyra looked down at the food in her hands, her mind racing. She hadn't planned on opening up to him. She didn't trust easily. But something about Mark's kindness, his unspoken understanding, made her want to share the truth that had been buried deep inside her for so long. Taking a deep breath, Lyra finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was a warrior for my people, the Vilrith. We were once a proud race, strong and respected across the galaxy. We were known for our honor, our discipline, and our power. She paused, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. It had been so long since she had spoken of her people, of the life she had left behind. Why did they leave you? Mark asked, his voice gentle, as if he were afraid to push too hard. Lara looked up at him, her eyes dark with memories. I refused an order, she said simply, in order to massacre innocent civilians, my people. They value strength above everything else. If you show any weakness, any hesitation, you're cast aside. They saw my refusal as betrayal. Mark didn't speak at first. He just listened, his expression thoughtful. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice filled with quiet admiration. You did the right thing. Lyra shook her head, the guilt rising in her chest. I should have followed the order. I should have been strong enough to do it. I failed. You didn't fail, Mark said firmly, his eyes locking with hers. You chose what was right. That takes more strength than any order could. Lyra felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She had never allowed herself to feel this vulnerable. Her people had always taught her to suppress emotions, to remain stoic and unyielding. But with Mark, it was different. He didn't judge her. He didn't see her as weak. He saw her as someone worthy of respect. I've never known kindness like this, Lyra admitted softly, her voice trembling. You're a human, someone I was taught to think of as weak. But you're not weak. You saved me, Mark smiled, a small, warm smile that made Lyra's heart flutter unexpectedly. We're not all what we're taught to be. I've learned that the hard way. Lyra sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on his words. She had been raised to believe that strength was everything. Her people, the Velrith, had conquered countless worlds, ruled with an iron fist, and shown no mercy. But what had it brought them? The fall of their empire, the betrayal of one of their own. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, filled with understanding. They had both shared parts of themselves that they had never expected to reveal. Lyra's past, her pain, and her fears. Mark's quiet strength, his belief in the goodness of others. Eventually, Mark broke the silence. What happens now, Lyra? Do you want to go back to your people? The question hung in the air. Lyra stared out the window for a long time, thinking. Her past, her people, they were no longer her concern. She had been abandoned, cast aside as if she didn't matter. But here, with Mark, she felt as though she mattered, as though her choices had meaning. No, she said softly, shaking her head. I can't go back. They wouldn't accept me. Not after what I did. Mark nodded, his expression kind. Then what will you do? What do you want? Lyra looked at him, feeling a sense of something new rising inside her. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a choice. She wasn't a warrior for the Velrith anymore. She wasn't bound by the rules of her people. She was free. I don't know, she admitted, her voice low. But I want to find a new purpose. Something that doesn't involve fighting. Something that matters. Mark smiled again, the warmth of his expression making her feel a little lighter. We'll figure it out together. For the first time since she had been abandoned, Lyra allowed herself to believe that she could start over. That she could rebuild her life. And maybe, just maybe, she could find something worth living for. A future beyond the battlefield. Lyra had only just begun to feel a sense of peace when the quiet was broken by a distant sound, a low, rumbling hum that seemed to vibrate the ground beneath them. She stiffened, her senses instantly alert. Her body, though healing, was still weak, but she couldn't ignore the feeling of danger creeping up on them. Mark was still sitting at the table, scanning some maps he had found in the shelter when Lyra's sharp eyes caught the movement outside. She stood quickly, ignoring the slight dizziness that followed. She approached the window, careful not to make a sound. What's happening? Mark asked, noticing her sudden shift in posture. I think we're not alone, Lyra whispered. Her voice was calm, but filled with the urgency of someone who knew how to sense danger. There's something out there. Mark stood and walked over to her, joining her at the window. He too squinted into the distance, where dark shapes were moving along the horizon. The figures were large, with strange silhouettes too large to be just wandering creatures. Could be enemies, Lyra said, narrowing her eyes. I didn't think they'd find us so soon. Mark's expression hardened. You think they're looking for you? I'm a traitor to my people, Lyra replied flatly. They'll be after me until they're sure I'm dead. Mark clenched his fists. He had been protecting Lyra for days now, caring for her, and he wasn't about to let anyone harm her. He had come to trust her, and the idea of losing her now, after everything, filled him with a deep sense of fear. We can't stay here, Mark said, his voice resolute. We need to move. Lyra turned to face him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and determination. If we run, they'll catch us. If we fight, it might be our last fight, Mark thought for a moment. He knew Lyra was right. They were outnumbered. In the shelter they were offered little protection against a full-on assault. But there was no choice. They couldn't afford to just hide. We fight, Mark decided, his voice steady. I don't care how many they are. I won't let them hurt you. Lyra studied him for a moment, and then nodded. There was something in Mark's words that filled her with an unfamiliar sense of warmth. A human, willing to stand by her side, even when he knew how dangerous it was. She had been trained to be a warrior, but never had she been shown such loyalty by another being. All right, she said quietly, we fight. Together, they began preparing for what was to come. Lyra had only a few weapons left, the remnants of her former life. Mark had a few tools of his own, and he quickly set up traps around the shelter. Using the environment to his advantage, he had learned quickly how to use whatever he could find. The alien planet was harsh, but it offered resources that could be used to their benefit, while Mark worked on setting up defenses. Lyra took a moment to gather her thoughts. Her past had always been filled with fighting, with battles that never seemed to end. But now, standing side by side with a human, she realized something. She had never fought for something she truly believed in. It had always been about loyalty. To her people, to her leaders, but never for herself. Mark looked up from his work, catching her eye. You ready? Lyra nodded, feeling something new stir inside her. She wasn't alone anymore. This fight was not just about survival, it was about standing up for herself. For what she believed in. Ready, she replied. They took positions around the shelter, their hearts beating in unison as the sound of the approaching enemy grew. Louder, Lyra's hand tightened around her weapon, a sleek alien gun she had scavenged from the battlefield. She could feel the weight of it, the power it held. But more than that, she felt the responsibility that came with wielding it. As the enemy approached, Mark was ready. He had prepared the shelter's perimeter with traps, hidden pits, and makeshift barricades. It wouldn't be enough to defeat the enemy, but it would slow them down. By that time, Lyra took a deep breath, feeling the cool air rush into her lungs. She had fought many battles in her life, but none had ever felt like this. She was no longer fighting for a cause that didn't care about her. She was fighting for herself, for her survival, for her future. The first wave of enemies arrived, soldiers from her own people. She recognized their armor, the markings that indicated their rank. Her heart clenched with guilt. These were the very soldiers she had once called comrades, but now they were the enemy. Mark fired the first shot, hitting one of the soldiers in the leg. Lyra followed quickly, using her alien technology to send a burst of energy toward the advancing soldiers. The ground shook as the energy blast sent a shockwave through the area. Move back, Mark shouted, pulling Lyra behind a makeshift barricade. Lyra nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on the enemy. She had been trained to fight with precision, to analyze her surroundings and strike where it hurt the most. But now, with her human ally beside her, she realized that this battle was different. It wasn't just about killing the enemy, it was about protecting the life she was beginning to build, the future she was starting to see. The battle raged on, with Mark and Lyra working as a team, each covering the other's back. Lyra was faster and stronger, her alien skills allowing her to dodge attacks and strike with deadly force. Mark, though inexperienced in alien combat, used his knowledge of human tactics to set traps and outsmart their enemies. For a while, it seemed like they might win. They fought with everything they had, but as the battle wore on, Lyra could see the numbers beginning to overwhelm them. More soldiers arrived, their faces cold and determined. They wouldn't stop until they had captured or killed her. "We need to go," Lyra shouted, her voice urgent. "We can't hold them off forever." Mark shook his head. "We don't run. We stand our ground." Lyra could see the determination in his eyes, and for a moment, she hesitated. He was right. They couldn't just run. But the enemy was too strong. They needed to make a decision, and they needed to make it fast. "Fine," Lyra said, her voice filled with resolve. "We fight to the end." And as the battle continued, Lyra realized that this fight was more than just survival. It was the beginning of her new life. She was no longer alone, and she would never be abandoned again. The battle outside the shelter had reached a fever pitch. The enemy soldiers were relentless, their numbers growing by the minute. Lyra and Mark had fought back bravely, using every trick they had learned to survive. The once quiet planet had become a war zone, filled with the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and the cries of the wounded. Lyra crouched behind a makeshift barricade, her heart pounding in her chest. Sweat dripped down her face, and her muscles burned from exhaustion. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close to winning. Mark, just a few feet away, was reloading his weapon. His movements were quick and precise. Despite the chaos around him, he looked over at Lyra, his face grim but determined. "We can't keep this up forever," he shouted over the noise of the battle. "I know," Lyra replied, her voice steady, despite the fear creeping into her chest. "But we can't run." "Not yet," Mark nodded, his eyes narrowing as another group of soldiers approached. "Then let's finish this." With a silent understanding, the two of them moved as one. Lyra fired first, sending a burst of energy toward the advancing soldiers. The blast knocked one of them off their feet, but there were more coming. She quickly moved to a new position, making sure to stay out of the line of sight. Mark followed her, laying down covering fire as he moved. The battle was far from over, but Lyra could feel the tide beginning to turn. Their enemies were starting to hesitate, unsure of whether they could overpower the two humans working together. But there was still danger. Lyra's body was growing weaker with each passing minute, and she knew that they couldn't continue this fight indefinitely. "Mark, we need to fall back," she said urgently, her voice low but firm. "We can't win this without reinforcements." Mark shook his head. "There's no time. If we run now, they'll catch us. We have to finish this." Lyra's gaze met his, and for the first time since they had met, she saw the fire in his eyes. He wasn't going to give up. Not on her. Not on their survival. "We'll finish it together," Lyra said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "But we need to stay alive first." Mark didn't answer, but he didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than words. He moved quickly, expertly, darting between cover and taking down one soldier after another. Lyra, though weary, followed his lead. She had always been a warrior, trained to fight for her life and her people. But in this moment, she realized something. It wasn't just about fighting anymore. It was about fighting for each other, for the life they had built together, even if it was only temporary. The battle stretched on, but slowly, the enemy forces began to retreat. Lyra and Mark had held their ground. Together, they had repelled the attackers. As the last soldier turned and fled, Mark and Lyra collapsed to the ground, their bodies shaking with exhaustion. For a few moments, there was nothing but silence. The sound of their heavy breathing was the only thing breaking the stillness of the aftermath. Lyra's body ached, her injuries still fresh and painful, but she couldn't help the sense of relief that washed over her. They had done it. They had survived. Mark sat beside her, his face smeared with dirt and sweat. He looked over at her, his eyes tired but filled with gratitude. "We did it," he said, his voice hoarse. Lyra gave him a weak smile. "Yes, we did." There was a quiet moment between them, one filled with an unspoken understanding. They had fought for their lives, for the future they were beginning to build, and in that fight, they had discovered something more than just survival. They had discovered that they could rely on each other, that they weren't as alone as they had once believed. Mark leaned back against the wall of the shelter, his breathing still heavy. "You're incredible. Lyra, I've never seen anyone fight like you." Lyra's eyes softened as she looked at him. "I wasn't always like this," she said quietly. "I was trained to be a warrior, but I never knew what it meant to fight for something worth fighting for." Mark raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Lyra paused for a moment, collecting her thoughts. "Back on my home planet, I was just another soldier. We fought in endless wars for power, for control. But none of it mattered. Not really. We were taught to follow orders, to obey without question. But when I refused that order, it felt different. I chose what was right, and that choice cost me everything." Mark nodded, understanding. "But it wasn't a failure. You made the right choice. That's something to be proud of." Lyra's eyes met his, and for the first time, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Mark's words weren't just comforting, they were the truth. She had done the right thing, even if it had cost her everything she had known. For a long moment, they sat in silence, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. They had survived the battle, but more than that, they had survived together. They had fought side by side, and in doing so, they had formed a bond stronger than either of them could have imagined. Eventually, Mark stood up and stretched, his muscles sore from the fight. He offered a hand to Lyra, helping her to her feet. "We need to get moving," he said, glancing outside the shelter. "We've won this round. But the war isn't over." Lyra took his hand, feeling the strength in his grip. She didn't hesitate. She knew they had a long road ahead of them, but she also knew that she wasn't alone. And for the first time in a long time, the thought brought her comfort. "We'll keep moving," she said, her voice steady. "Together." And as they prepared to leave the shelter, the bond between them, forged in the heat of battle, remained unbroken. The world outside might still be filled with dangers, but Lyra and Mark knew that they could face whatever came next, together. The shelter was silent now. The echoes of battle had faded, leaving only the quiet hum of the wind outside. Lyra and Mark stood in the middle of the small, makeshift shelter, the weight of what they had just survived pressing down on them. They had won, but the victory felt like a temporary peace, a brief respite in what seemed like an endless war. Lyra's body still ached from the fight, the wounds she had taken during the battle a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. But the pain was bearable. What weighed on her now was something deeper, the realization that everything she had known was gone. Her people, her past, and the life she had once lived were all lost in the wake of her refusal to follow orders. Mark, too, was exhausted. His hands were calloused from the long hours of building traps and fighting, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. But he had kept his promise to protect her, and now, as they both stood in the aftermath, there was a quiet sense of accomplishment in the air. They had faced the impossible together, and they had survived. "Are you okay?" Mark asked, his voice soft as he watched Lyra carefully. She nodded slowly, though the words felt heavy in her chest. "I'm alive," she said simply. "That's all that matters." Mark smiled, though it was faint. "We've made it this far. We'll keep going." Lyra turned toward him, her gaze steady. "But where do we go from here? We've defeated the enemy here, but they'll come again. I don't want to keep running, Mark." He stepped closer, his expression thoughtful. "We don't have to keep running. Not anymore. We can find a way to end this." For a long moment, Lyra simply looked at him. She had spent her entire life running from the shadows of war, from the weight of responsibility. But now, standing here with Mark, something was different. She realized that running away wasn't the answer. If she truly wanted to build something new, something beyond the pain of her past, she would have to face the future head-on. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with curiosity. Mark walked to the table where the maps were still spread out, his fingers brushing over the edges. "We've got the skills to fight. We've got each other. And maybe, just maybe, we can stop the cycle of violence that's followed us both for so long. We could form something different, a team. Not just to survive, but to make a difference, Lyra listened, the idea sinking in. A team. She had always fought alone, raised to believe that strength meant independence. But Mark's words were a spark in the dark. She had never considered the possibility of building something with others, of forging a new life. With people who cared, who would stand by her side through anything. I don't know if I'm ready for that, Lyra admitted, her voice uncertain. I've lost so much, and I've been betrayed by my own people. How do I trust anyone again? Mark's eyes softened with understanding. He knew the pain of betrayal, the weight of distrust. I get it, he said. I've been there. But I can tell you this, you're not alone anymore. We can rebuild. We can make something better. Together, Lyra stood in silence for a moment, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had lost. But in that silence, something shifted inside her. For the first time, she didn't feel completely lost. Mark had become more than just an ally. He had become a friend, a partner, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to build something worth fighting for. You're right, Lyra said finally, her voice steady. We can make something better. I want to believe that. I want to fight for something more than just survival. Mark smiled, his face lighting up with the relief of hearing those words. Then we'll do it, one step at a time. They both turned toward the entrance of the shelter, where the sun was beginning to set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the land. The future was uncertain, but for the first time since she had been abandoned, Lyra felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe she could create a new future, one where she wasn't defined by her past. We need a plan, Lyra said, her tone practical. If we're going to take this fight to them, we need to know what we're up against. Mark nodded. I've got some contacts in a nearby settlement. They might be able to help us gather intel on what's really going on in this sector. Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly. How do you know you can trust them? Mark paused for a moment, his expression serious. I don't, but right now, we don't have many choices. If we stay here, we're just waiting for the enemy to find us again. If we move forward, we might find allies who can help us. Lyra considered this. She had never been one to trust easily, but Mark had proven himself time and again. Maybe it was time for her to take a leap of faith as well. All right, she said, her voice firm. Let's go meet these contacts. But we do it on our terms. Mark smiled, the first real smile he had shown in days. On our terms, I like that. They gathered their things and prepared to leave, making sure everything was packed and ready for the journey ahead. As they stepped out of the shelter, the cool evening air brushed against their skin, and the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky. Lyra looked up at the stars, her thoughts far away. She had once believed that her life was over, that her choices had led her to a place of no return. But now, with Mark by her side, she saw a different future, one where she wasn't defined by her failures, but by the choices she made moving forward together. They walked into the night, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. And for the first time in a long time, Lyra felt a sense of peace. The future was uncertain, but she no longer had to face it alone.